Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening for those who are in Budapest, New York, London, or Wien watching us. My name is László Ruszt. I'm the co-director of CEU Democracy Institute. I would like to welcome the editors, the panelists, and the guests of the book launch of the Routledge Handbook of IIliberalism. The Democracy Institute, or the DI as we call it, was created a year ago, after the Central European University was forced to leave Hungary by an illiberal regime. What makes this volume special is, of course, not this fact, but that this volume represents the spirit, the core values, and the ethos of DI at its very best. It is devoted to genuine intellectual challenge that calls for multidisciplinary analysis. It is based on cutting-edge research. It's mobilizing global network of scholars, and it offers novel insights on a subject of practical significance. And these are exactly the goals and the core values of the working groups of DI, dealing with redemocratization, the rule of law, inequalities and democracy, or the democracy in history. The theme of illiberalism speaks to subjects covered by the core working groups of DI, and what is perhaps the most valuable in this volume is that the editors and the authors approach the topic from multidisciplinary background, and they provide an example for how DI, that has medievalists, sociologists, lawyers, and political scientists, students of network sciences and gender studies, so how DI that has representatives of such diverse disciplines could create cross-cutting research on a highly relevant topic. We are also very proud to mention that the editors and several of the authors are affiliated with the DI. Some are founding members of both the Central European University and DI, like András Sajó, the founding dean of legal studies of CEU. And Stephen Holmes, who was also the first to advise DI and who is a distinguished member of the advisory board of DI, or like Renata Uitz, who is the co-director of DI and is one of the prime movers of making DI the site of cutting-edge research based on cross-disciplinary analysis. Still others like Jennifer McCoy or Martin Krige are our distinguished visitors. So let us celebrate the first edition of this great volume that offers novel insight on familiar themes and that signals new directions for future research. Let me finish with noting that DI, as an integral part of CEU Wien and its activities, is closely interlinked with the teaching and research activities of CEU departments in Wien. Two of the three editors are also faculty members of the Department of Legal Studies at CEU Wien, and it's just natural that we celebrate this volume together with the department. So let me pass the word to Matthias Moschel, the head of the Department of Legal Studies.
Thank you so much, László. Thanks to everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. Good evening, good day, good afternoon, good morning. Again, we would certainly have preferred this to be an on-site event, and I promise that I will not take away too much time from the substantive discussions, and I'm honored to say a couple of words of opening tonight for Vienna. So first of all, I would like to congratulate the editors, the authors, and everyone who contributed to this wonderful handbook. So it's really a pleasure to see the to see the outcome of a fruitful cooperation between the DI, but also legal studies, cooperation which is literally embodied by two of the editors sitting here, Professor András Sajó and Professor Renata Uitz. And at the same time, this handbook is also the outcome of research-based teaching, which brought to CEU several experts from around the globe for workshops and conferences on important issues addressed here in this handbook, and experts who have been, in part, also recurring visiting professors at the Legal Studies Department for years. So what is less visible possibly as well is, but not less important, is that the outcome presented to you today was also made possible thanks to the behind the scenes work of our doctoral researchers who've been copy editing, providing editorial support, and as well as the staff members of both the Democracy Institute but also legal studies. So a big thanks to everyone for making this happen. Second, sort of as with every project, one realizes at the end that it's only the beginning of something more, and that it opens up new conversations, new avenues for research, as also indicated in the final chapter of this book. And here, sort of in view of these future conversations, just to add a couple of reflections from my very own narrow research angles on gender and race and law, there's also the former gender figures prominently in at least one chapter in this handbook, and we've witnessed at how gender became one of the targets of an illiberal regime. As to the latter with regard to race, and here I admit I haven't had the chance to look at all of the details in single chapters in detail so far. So the chapters on migration and multiculturalism do touch upon the topic. But otherwise, race and racism are not necessarily featuring prominently here as a separate and specific angle of analysis. So I thought that it might be interesting to explore that relationship between race and racism and illiberalism in a future chapter. And here the role of critical race theory in the current rhetoric and regulatory attacks against, in US and in Europe, against this intellectual movement would be interesting to analyze. And I think the distinction between anti-liberal and illiberal, which is key to this book, can certainly provide some help. It should be said that critical race theory is a thorn in the eye to both illiberal regimes, as it seems to be to liberalism, in as much as one accepts that CRT is either anti-liberal or even an intellectual source of illiberalism. But again, I don't want to bore you with further elaborations, and I just wanted to throw these thoughts into the mix tonight. I'm sure that each and every one of you in the audience will, be able to discover their own treasure trove of thoughts and ideas in this book. So in that sense, I truly look forward to discussions in the future. And in the meantime, I wish everyone here a wonderful book launch evening and fruitful conversations and encounters despite the online reality. And I excuse myself as well for not being able to stay probably for the whole duration of this event. But thank you so much again, and all the best.
Thank you very much. And I immediately pass the word to President and Rector of CEU, Sharini Randeria, who just managed to connect. So the floor is yours, Sharini, please.
Thank you so much, Laszlo, and thanks for the invitation. Sorry for having joined late. There were connection issues here from London. So what I would like to do is, first of all, to congratulate to you, the DI, but also especially Renata and Andras Shayo for co-editing this really, really wide-ranging collection of articles, essays, contributions to the topic of illiberalism. I think you are treading here on new territory, because a lot of the work on liberalism has so far not been done either in a theoretical or a comparative perspective, which is being offered here. So I'm really happy to be able to speak very briefly at the inaugural event. But first of all, warm congratulations on this achievement. That said, just a very few quick remarks. I think one of the most important ideas which comes across as reflected in many of the chapters in the handbook is the relational nexus between liberalisms and illiberalisms. But not only is it a relational nexus between the two, but it's both in the plural. So it's constantly reminding us that there is a family resemblance between different kinds of liberalism, just as there is one between different sorts of illiberalisms. And so it's not a simplistic dichotomy that we are looking at, but a plurality on both sides. And then we need to look at their relationship with one another. It also, I think, is a very useful reminder about the fact that both terms are polysemic. They are fluid terms used in different contexts by different actors to often mean different things, and that unfreedom may be compatible with democracy, and that this disjuncture of liberalism and democracy is, I think, a very interesting aspect of many of the chapters that you have gathered here together. So not only are there illiberal practices and beliefs in liberal regimes, but that they even may be present in liberal theories. So that, if I quote from one of the chapters here, illiberalism is deeply embedded, or at least tolerated, in the name of democracy in liberal constitutional systems. And I think this is a very, very important insight. Just as in the very last chapter, you make a strong call for a return to history, a history of ideas, but also of history of practices. And of course, for an anthropologist like myself, I'm very happy about the return to looking at practices of illiberalism. For both theoretical reasons, to understand the phenomena, but also for political reasons of trying to understand where the red lines here are and have been. One of the other things I learned, so in a sense, there are historical processes that we need to look at very carefully in order to look at what has led to the kinds of attacks on public reason that we have seen, the appeal to irrationality, to certain kinds of emotions, of resentment, negative emotions, the control of media, also the whole question of post-truth, which you flag in the volume. But the sources of illiberalism, sort of the inherent anti-liberalism in liberal traditions, in the plural, the tension between economic liberalism and neoliberalism, that's another important theme, I think, which the volume sheds a lot of light on. Also thinking about the internal contradictions of liberal nationalism, as some of your authors do, and also radical critiques of liberalism, both from the right and from the left, is something which I think the volume has to be congratulated for putting together. The other lesson I learned was from reading some of the chapters, was looking at the different pathways to the normalization of illiberal regimes. So the need to really look at the specificity of various political, historical, social contexts. But I think that is something which needs further study, as does the relationship between political and social psychology. So totalitarian, authoritarianism, looking at some of the questions which you raised there are, I think, an important point of the research agenda that I see the handbook as charting. As is also maybe two other points in this connection, I think the kinds of research agendas which you open out are questions of looking at the international and the global socioeconomic conditions in which the liberal world order is being challenged. And of course, looking at the question of attacks and consistent attacks on academic freedom, and especially from the right now, who have become the guardians of academic freedom. So I'm speaking to you from London, and it's Tories who are now tabling a bill in Parliament on academic freedom, on protecting academic freedom. So it's really a reversal of the vocabularies of progressive vocabularies of the left, liberal discourses, which have been taken up by these forces. I think the theoretical perspectives which you have are many and varied, and I think that's a good thing, that there is it's not a sort of unified volume in that sense. It is bringing many different voices here to a debate on questions of the disjuncture between liberalism and democracy, looking at, as I said, the plurality, also looking at many of the questions of what could a theory of illiberalism look like? Can there be a theory, and what kinds of conceptual genealogies can we bring to the fore? Questions of the forms of illiberal government, the ideas and the forces, the political forces, the actors who are driving these illiberal agendas, the relationship between populism and illiberalism. And I said, for me as an anthropologist, the fourth part on illiberal practices was a very, very interesting part because it has entries on surveillance, on media control, on post-truth. And there's a really important point being made here in this particular part, which is looking at illiberal practices endemic also to liberal democracies. So let me just end by two quick comments. One, I think, on the reliance of illiberal regimes on formally democratic processes and the use of these processes to hollow out liberal institutions from within. And one, to continue, the second, to continue a discussion I had on my podcast, Democracy in Question, which I hope to continue with Renata in the next episode, the one I had with Andras, which I thought was very, very important to make the point, these regimes are still democracies, and they may not have anything to do with fair elections because of the kinds of practices of voter suppression, gerrymandering, etc., which these rulers have put in place, but they do have something to do with free elections. And so there is a family resemblance between liberal democracies and these regimes, which we would actually overlook at our own peril. So they do enjoy popular legitimacy, they do enjoy popular support, and if we really want to craft strategies against these regimes, we really need to understand the fact that they still belong to a wider family of democratic political regimes, whether we like it or not. And I think that's an important point which we often forget if we just tend to bracket them out completely out of the whole gamut of democratic institutions and values. So thank you very much for a rich set of contributions, which gave me a lot of food for thought. And I hope to continue the discussion with you. And I will now try and see if I can rescue my laptop in a way that I can continue to be with you for the next 2 hours. I just need to find the right British plugs for my continental European cables.
Thank you very much for your comment, and I pass immediately the word over to Renata, who is going to moderate this event further.
Thank you very much, Laci, and thanks a lot to everyone for joining us. My task first is to turn to Michael Ignatieff, who in many of current and prior capacities supported this project over the years. He had faith in it when it was an intellectual themes initiative. He attended many a conference and many a workshop. So I'm delighted to hear from Michael whether we managed to disappoint him utterly or whether there is still some hope at the end of the tunnel as he sees it.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you, Laci. This is a proud moment for the Democracy Institute, and it's a very proud moment for CEU. I mean, it's a tremendous vindication of a certain thing about CEU that I think really does need to be celebrated. We were victims of illiberalism. We got taken and expelled by an illiberal regime. And instead of kind of rolling ourselves into a little pathetic, cringing ball, we've in fact managed to reestablish ourselves in Vienna. We've managed to continue our presence in Budapest with the Democracy Institute. And above all, we've thought hard about what liberalism is. Instead of being focused obsessively on the Hungarian story alone, we've tried to widen our research perspective. And what makes the handbook so outstanding is the truly global reach of the inquiry. The global reach of it and the interdisciplinarity on display. if you look at who's here, we've got history, my discipline, political theory, political science, comparative politics, psychology, international relations, anthropology, economics, and last but not least, gender studies. All of these lenses have been trained on the phenomenon of illiberalism, and I think the result is going to set the standard for academic discussion of this broad issue for years to come. So it's a real moment of pride and a kind of defining moment for what CEU stands for. I want to single out one person who's been involved in that, and that's Stephen Holmes. Renata and Andras deserve all praise, but I think it's important to notice that Stephen Holmes has been a kind of friend, partner, member of the CEU team going back to the 1990s. One of the things that defines us as a university, in fact, has been our capacity to attract absolutely top rank, first tier academics of distinction like Stephen, and their loyalty and devotion to our project is touching and important. He's not alone. There are lots of others, but this is my moment to go. Stephen, thank you so much for sticking with us, and I hope you found your collaboration with us as useful as it has been to us. Just two final thoughts here. When I look at the way in which illiberalism is defined in this collection, I see it as a form of politics. So it's majoritarianism at war with counter-majoritarian restraints on power. I see it as a political style, a way of doing politics, which is anti-elite, anti-civility, anti-compromise. I see it as a mentality, a worldview of decline, threat, and menace, which justifies restoration and revolt. It's an epistemology, which has a particular view of what truth is in politics. And it's also a social vision, anti-elite, anti-expert, anti-tolerant, anti-permissive. So what's impressive about the collection is that it assembles a picture of a liberalism which is so much more multidimensional than the more narrowly political ones we've had in the past. I'd conclude with one thing that I think builds on what Shalini said, which is that I remember one of our, great, most illustrious figures at CEU, Janos Kish, gave a memorable talk in a series which I chaired years ago, in which he said, illiberal democracy is a contradiction in terms. You can't have a democracy that is illiberal. And one of the disturbing issues raised by this book is whether, in fact, you can have, and I think this is a point made by Andras Shayo, whether you can have a democracy that is actually liberal in form. That is, it is legitimized by democratic elections of some kind, however gerrymandered and however messed with, but it is legitimized, power is legitimized with democratic rhetoric, democratic practices, and democratic procedures. But it's actually illiberal in form, illiberal in style, illiberal in mentality, and illiberal in epistemology. This, it seems to me, is the new face of the threat to democracy in the 21st century. That is, regimes that are not authoritarian, they're not totalitarian, they are democracies that purvey and exercise a profoundly illiberal form of rule. And I think if the handbook launches and makes more precise the debate about this new form of political threat to liberal values, it will perform a very useful service. Thanks so much. I hand it back to Renata.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was really inspiring, and you do bring us to more of a conversational form with two of my co-editors and one of our contributors, Helena Brosenblatt, who wrote a very important chapter on the history of illiberalism and the anti-liberal idea. And what we were thinking is, instead of making unilateral contributions, we will have a bit of a conversation that starts with the first question being, what gives this project, according to you, urgency today? I mean, Stephen, you've been writing about anti-liberalism since the late 1980s. How has the world changed, and how have the stakes changed since those days?
Great, thanks. And it's a pleasure to be here. And it's always been a pleasure to work at CEU. I was there from the beginning, and it's an amazing, big part of my life, actually. So I like your question because it's based on a distinction between the match and the straw. That is, someone can light the match, but is the straw dry? Does this ideology take off? Under what conditions is it going to become virulent? Because the trite cluster of ideas that are under the umbrella, this broad term of illiberalism or anti-liberalism, has existed for a couple centuries or more, but only in certain periods does it become politically dangerous. A lot of the time, it's just, it's morally repugnant. People talk about community and things of this kind, but it doesn't have a political danger to it. And now it does. We're entering into a period where popular support is organized, has come to political parties and governments that are attacking independent judiciary, attacking independent press, independent academic life, and so on. So it has become dangerous now, that in a way that it wasn't before. Now, we see that the sort of authoritarian, xenophobic, anti-migrant, the playing upon the scaremongering about multiculturalism, about great replacement, and so on. This seems to be a kind of universal characteristic. There seems to be, if you look at what's a pattern across illiberal politics in the world, there is always an element of rural versus urban going on. But I want to just focus for my couple of minutes here on the two things that are relevant to the United States, which is, this is an urgent topic because one of our two political parties has been taken over by an illiberal movement, an illiberal movement that is flirting or is white supremacist, that is flirting with, well, not flirting with, that's saying that violence is a legitimate political weapon, that our politics in the United States now, because of the Republican Party, is dominated by death threats, attacks even on healthcare workers, because this the sense that the war against liberalism is going to permit its enemies to engage in activities which otherwise would have been, or in political contestation that would otherwise be processed through a democratic means, preparing for the next election, and so on. And the second, so the first thing, which shows how urgent it is that illiberalism is now associated with violence. And the second is, of course, it's antagonism to science. And it's amazing how much right-wing extremism has picked up the anti-vax methodology, the attack on science, the attack on secular reason. And this is, of course, it isn't, I mean, CEU is a kind of canary in the coal mine in the sense that there's a very strong sense of one of the places that illiberalism is going to have to attack and is going to have to take on in order to, if it's able to press its supremacy over our societies, is the university. And the university's reaction, I think, of course, Michael has been a hero of this movement, but there are weaknesses in the university. It's very vulnerable. So these are the urgency point is violence and anti-science, which are two of the most grave problems in our current society, and they are organized and expressed as an anti-liberal attack on liberalism.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So let me turn to Helena, because in your chapter, it's a strong theme that anti-liberalism and liberalism are developing hand in hand, not necessarily in conversation with each other, but these are political actors who are inhabiting similar political milieus at historic moments. And there is a turn in your chapter where you turn from ideas and the search for vocabularies to actually pointing out that an illiberal tradition is born. So how do you how do you explain the relevance of moving from ideas to an illiberal intellectual tradition, and the significance of writing about it today, of all days?
Well, first, I just like to say how very proud and grateful I am to have been included in this important project and to be part of this distinguished panel today. As you rightly say, I am particularly interested, or have been, and in definitions, and words matter. And it sometimes today feels like everybody's talking about liberal democracy, the crisis of liberal democracy. There's so many books on it. There's so much talk about it in the media and so on, and especially in academic circles, of course, but less about illiberalism. So one of the great things about this book is how much it sheds light on really what illiberalism is. And I agree so much with Shalini's opening remarks about how it is something very different from democracy. It always has been. It always has been, going back to the very beginning. It may be difficult, it may sound silly or trite to talk about definitions when something so very, and to be so picky about terms, but I do believe that sort of muddy definitions lead to muddled thinking and facile conclusions, and it causes people really to talk past each other. And at this very critical moment, it's important to get these terms correct and know what we're talking about when we talk about illiberalism. One of the things, I think that actually the difference between anti-liberalism and illiberalism is so beautifully explained by Stephen Holmes's introductory essays that I may not talk so much about that right now. But it causes us, this confusion about terms causes us to miss very important things, I think. And one is something that I, like many of you, are worried about is actually the illiberalism of the left and illiberalism within the academy. I discussed this a little bit in my chapter towards the end. What are we going to do about this thing we call cancel culture, about perhaps excessive emphasis on political correctness, what has been called creeping illiberalism on college campuses. I'm talking about the United States mainly, and the academic world and environment I am part of. And also a kind of, related to this is a kind of cynicism, and I believe an overly negative attitude to our liberal institutions that people have fought so very hard to put into place, our Constitution, fundamental rights like freedom of speech and freedom of the press and so on. The intolerance that we see not only on the right, but even within the left. Of course, the main problem is what Stephen Holmes spoke about, is this kind of the disaster that's happening with the Republican Party. But so as to bring forth something else is the worry I have about illiberalism on college campuses. Perhaps I should say, if I have time, I can bring that up later. I don't want to go on for too long.
Thank you very much, Helena. Let me now turn to Professor Shayo. So we heard about the urgency from Stephen and Helena. So what prompted the volume, and how did you see the urgency of producing and convening over 70 people to to force themselves to think in terms that they are usually not thinking about a phenomenon that is worrisome, but disciplines usually don't tackle it head on.
Thank you, Renata, and it's a real pleasure to be in this company. Some of the colleagues who participated, others who gave some intellectual encouragement or inspired the work. And by the way, if I may present the volume, which is here for our distinguished audience, I'm not following instructions of Routledge, which is the publisher, but just in case, this is it. It's, yeah, you can see it's like a serious volume in terms of its weight. Now, to the question raised, so of course books have their history. This idea was submitted to another publisher. At that time, they were probably not interested, and then went to another one. And by that time, this was the issue. So they immediately jumped on it, although it was something that they never encountered. I guess there's a brilliant person with whom I exchanged this, and it was clear that this is something new to her. There is nothing systematic on this, and probably even after these 1,000 pages, there is nothing systematic, and there will not be something systematic on illiberalism, because it is a series of practices and theories and reactions. Now, the interesting thing is that although it is, or we present it in many respects as a reaction to something, but of course, illiberalism is in a way predates liberalism. So in a way, illiberalism is the natural form, and liberalism was an invention, a more or less deliberate effort to end or demise those practices, irrationality, intolerance, etc. The problem is that once more or less successful, liberalism seemed to forget that they are still the unnatural. And this is exactly the problem that we have today with what some people call illiberal democracy. And really, it's not the moment to enter into discussion how, to what extent it's democracy when it is really, really illiberal. That's a very interesting debate. But what I really wanted to say is that this type of regimes, or these types of regimes, they rely on something that is not only imposed on society. It's not just a manipulation. It is something that relies on an existing socially present and socially already construed illiberalism, which is very inconvenient or unpleasant for someone who thought that we live in a relatively comfortable liberal world and we move in agreement towards a better, more and more tolerant, more and more inclusive society. We thought that this is the normal way of things. And now we are a little bit surprised, and we don't know how to react to these sources which were contained, these illiberal elements, which were practices which were contained at the family level, but of course liberals respect the family, right? So, okay, if it's a family is illiberal, there is patriarchal supremacy, well, okay, you can't really enter into that too much. A little bit, yes, but not too much, because there are limits to what the state or even society can do, and so on and so forth. Religion, churches, same story. Church autonomy has to be guaranteed, and that means you guarantee illiberal practices. So suddenly these enclaves became much more important, much more powerful. forget, and I would like to add, of course, that modern social media did play a very important role in the liberation of illiberalism. So I think this is what really triggered this interest in illiberalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Stephen, because I can see that liberalism as the acquired taste is making him think hard on where this conversation goes. So Stephen.
I like what Andras said, although I'm not so sure about how far he wants to go with the return of something archaic, as opposed to, there's a modernist strand in illiberal movements too. But yes, I mean, the main point is that liberal democracy is a tiny spot in human history. It's not the kind of ordinary way human beings organize their lives for hundreds, I mean, as long as we've had organized polities, 5,000, 10,000 years. And in history, human beings are aggressive, dogmatic, intolerant, hostile to strangers. These are all, impartiality is not really a kind of, the norm to which we all revert when we're feeling so forth. So this is all true, which means, I think fundamentally, that for liberalism to survive, it requires effort. It requires working at it. But this is not something that's going to just happen. And if you have a society like ours in which the liberal forces are very fragmented, in which liberalism is being attacked also from the left, in which there's a sort of kind of something, the air has gone out of the balloon. And this is a term that's used in a derogatory way, and I think it shouldn't be. Cold War liberalism was a very important, Cold War liberalism developed because these Western societies, the United States and Western Europe, were organizing themselves, and the US was the mover here, organizing themselves around being not like the Soviet Union. So the values of fair trial, freedom of the press, and including civil rights. As you know, there is Cold War, Brown v. Board of Education was in large extent a product of fighting the Soviet Union. The Soviets were accusing Americans of racism, and there was this saying that this is something we can't allow to fester. It's weakening us. Now, the Cold War is over. Not only has that tended to weaken the Atlantic Alliance, it's also weakened alliances within the country of the US. And it was followed quickly by 9/11, in which our sort of political elite decided that human rights were a vulnerability, that was somehow these were protecting our enemies and so on. So, the context is very important, but it doesn't mean, I very much believe that anti-liberalism also has its weak political weaknesses. That is the instantiations. Now, Trump, Orban, they have weaknesses. And if we work against them, they can be beaten. But it is important to keep in mind that this, as Andras said, that this is a unlikely achievement of humanity, creating liberal democracies. And that's why we can't just lean back and act like it's the normal state of affairs, although that is the world as I was born in 1948, that's the world I grew up in. So this is something that taken for grantedness is itself a vulnerability.
Thank you, Stephen. Over to Michael in a slight departure from the initially planned choreography.
Just a little thought on Cold War liberalism, since one of the saints of Cold War liberalism is the subject of my biography, Isaiah Berlin. And I don't think there's any doubt that the presence not only of the Soviet Union, but the memory of Stalinist murder and tyranny certainly stiffened the definitional spine of liberalism for a long time. I think, secondly, the heroic achievements of the FDR New Deal and its carryover into the 40s and 50s gave liberalism a kind of definitional based on its achievements. And the Piketty point that's been made often, but I think is true, which is that the Second War and Depression compression of inequalities created a space that we didn't really realize at the time between kind of 45 and 73 or 4, in which liberalism made a lot of sense because we were in a what turned out to be a highly artificially compressed range of inequalities. And so liberalism seemed to correspond to observable reality in some sense. It was easier to maintain political community when inequalities were compressed. And so some of the civilities, compromises, let's find the middle way rhetoric of liberalism seemed to correspond to the realities that then from the Nixon years onwards began to blow apart. And I think we know that history a little bit. The one thing I would add is, and I got this from Helena's very good chapter, made me think that one of the other things that's constitutive of liberalism is a connection between liberalism and civilization and civility. In some sense in which liberalism is talking about practices to make Shalini happy. Liberalism is a practice of civility. And essentially what civility means in political terms is managing one of the central problems of democracy, which is how to keep competition for power from being all devouring. And so civility is actually a practice of regarding your opponent as an adversary, not an enemy, someone who, is not trying to destroy you, they're just competing for power. And so there are rules, very carefully prescribed rules that are called in the Senate of the United States comity. Well, as Stephen is saying, this is just blown up. The real world in which liberal values can be practiced, is not possible. I mean, if Chuck Schumer goes in there and practices civility and comedy, there's no there there. There's no one with whom comedy and civility can be practiced. And that's had, I think, a devastating effect on the practices of liberalism. We stand for a certain kind of civility, not because we're a bunch of saps, but because we understand that the competition for power has to be moderated by certain rules. And those rules have been destroyed, I think, by inequality, by what's happened to the Republican Party. And it's not just in the United States, even. I would also argue that there's been some deep destruction of comedy and civility in the British political system. And since I'm a Canadian and there are trucks parked all the way around the parliament of my country as we speak, people who simply don't play by the rules of civility at all, we are in a new world as a result. And civility, our one of our core values, has been shredded.
Thank you, Michael. Could we? I see Helena unmuting, so maybe Helena is next.
Oh, sorry. I thought you would quite naturally come to me, but I just wanted to react to what was said here, and on the idea first that liberalism, that illiberal, and that liberalism was a reaction to illiberal. That illiberalism was what liberalism was designed to combat. Isms, according to me, are really the product of the invention of the 19th century. Before you had illiberalism and liberalism, you did, of course, have the words liberal and liberality and illiberal and illiberality. And this goes to also what Michael was just saying, is that liberal, going way back to Roman times, was a quality of a person and of a citizen, somebody who is devoted to the common good, and who has also, and over time, over the Enlightenment and so on, came to mean somebody, a gentleman, the values of a gentleman. Somebody with manners, somebody who had, it was an elitist concept in that sense, but it also meant having large-mindedness, generosity, all of these values that were thought to be necessary for a liberal regime. Now, liberalism, perhaps I should stop there because I know you want to go on to somebody else, but just to say that liberalism then was coined, according to my research, as a result of the French Revolution, and anti-liberalism as well, meaning something quite a little bit different, as Stephen Holmes has shown so well. But it maintained this sense of, since liberal meant gentlemanly, tolerant, the qualities of a person, illiberal meant the opposite. It meant being stingy, being intolerant, being, in Roman times, slavish, self-interested, not committed to the common good. And illiberalism then was a reaction to liberalism, intolerance, always with this kind of connotation of stinginess, of being unsociable, of being uncivil as well.
Thank you so much, Helena. The conversation took a very different turn a while back. So, and I think it's all for the better. One of the chapters which we actually couldn't get because it was extremely difficult to commission was about certain preconditions for liberalism as well as illiberalism in society. And having an anthropologist among us, I cannot stop myself from asking what should the directions on research on these preconditions, both for liberalism and illiberalism, be based on your input, Shalini, if you permit.
So, Renata, this is a difficult question for an anthropologist because we are better with the kinds of research tools which we have at our disposal, which is ethnographic fieldwork. We are better at diagnosing the present than trying to say what could, or a normative understanding of what could be the preconditions for a liberal democracy. I was just listening to the discussion and had a different question which occurred to me, which is, because I think one of the really interesting things about the handbook is its global reach and its comparative framework. And I think that the more interesting question to ask would be, many of the comments we've heard about civility, questions of tolerance, etc., which are raising, do they mean necessarily the very same things in South Africa, in Turkey, in India? What are the very different kinds of understandings of liberalism that people actually had when they put certain kinds of institutions in place, when they democratized those societies, and were they necessarily identical with some of the Euro-American ideas on this? Because you see, if you are thinking about this question from an Indian perspective, so this is not necessarily an anthropological perspective, but just from another corner of the world, the practice of British liberals was illiberal rule in the colonies. The empire was not about practicing liberalism abroad. It was about illiberal practices abroad while establishing citizenship rights, equality as values, principles, etc. at home. So actually, the entire history, if you like, of modern political institutions in Euro-America, especially in Europe, was Janus-faced, while certain liberal principles were being established in discourse and practice at home, what was being practiced in the colonies were absolutely hierarchical, racist, illiberal practices. And so in a sense, if you like, the anti-colonial movement was about reclaiming the ideas of liberalism against the practices of those who were ruling them in the name of denying them that democracy. So in a sense, the history of how these ideas traveled to the colonies, which is, 70% of the world's population, former colonies, how they get domesticated in a totally different political context, and how they are contested in that context as well. I think that might be an interesting question to think about different trajectories of both liberalism and illiberalism in different parts of the world. I think that might be the ethnographic, the social anthropological question.
Let me throw the ball to Matthias, please.
Yes, thanks a lot. And it was a little bit following up on the comments by Shalini, and there is, in some ways, I kind of hinted at it in my very short comments on this conundrum as well about the thought about the role that critical race theory, and I know that it's seen and portrayed as being sort of anti-liberal, and at the same time we see it being at the behest or at the attack of legislative initiatives to be prohibited in universities. And I think it highlights a difficulty as well about liberal scholars embracing some of these, while embracing or being silent and not being very active in the name of academic freedom about what is going on in a number of states in the United States, but also in France. We're seeing this, and this is not just necessarily illiberal regimes as such, but in France as well, where we had attacks by governments against post-colonial studies, a critical race theory, intersectionality, you name it. And the problem there, and this is why I thought at the beginning saying, it was interesting to think about this anti-liberal and illiberal at the same time, is that it poses a particular problem for liberal thoughts, because I haven't really seen the strong liberal stance on some of these initiatives saying, these attacks on post-colonialism, on critical race theory, on intersectionality are really, really difficult. And it really puts these things into focus, at least from my perspective, and sort of like it kind of tags on to what Shalini was just saying on this issue of liberalism and not always being exactly the same depending on the geographic reality, but then also the problem of having these lines not running exactly along the same line between anti-liberalism and illiberalism. And the same thing as well, post-colonial studies, intersectionality, critical race theory are not in power. They're not in any place where they can command a whole country, where they might have some voice limitedly in certain academic circles. But again, I think it is a little bit of it's a tricky place for liberals mostly to deal with those illiberal attacks on these kind of forms of scholarship. So I'll leave it at that, but thanks a lot.
Thank you, Matthias. At this point, I think we can go back to Helena, because her chapter, the last part of her chapter, actually talks about illiberalism in American academia, and this is where I cut her off initially, and I promised to be back. So, Helena, back to you.
Yes, as I think I mentioned, I am very concerned with this, with the cancel culture, what many people think is a growing illiberalism in the student body. For example, the not allowing certain invited guests with whom you disagree on various opinions to speak at campuses, to shout them down, to not want to teach. In my own case, I'm a firm believer in teaching, for example, the great books of Western civilization. I find that students often hostile to this. They want something completely different. Their intolerance is sometimes a question of kind of shouting down these thinkers or picking all the things they disagree with, and I find this very troubling as a historian who wants to, who thinks that it's very a good thing to engage with our intellectual traditions, and also that we should encourage thoughtful discussion on even difficult subjects. It was mentioned before, critical race theory, but to understand both sides of the question. And I often feel that we get it just from one side, or the students are encouraged from, certainly not from me, but from other professors, to take this very, very negative view. We also have the, Shalini is an anthropologist, and we have the sort of outcome of somebody like Talal Asad, a very thought-provoking and important scholar, but the thinking has gone in directions that when you start saying that there's something wrong with liberalism itself, that there's something, that liberalism itself is illiberal, I think we're going too far and in the wrong direction. They often, these sorts of people, they say, for example, they focus a lot on religious toleration and say that this is not actually liberal in some ways. It is, so it's hypocritical to say so, because religious toleration is in fact a kind of Protestant, it comes from Protestantism, and it's a kind of a surreptitious way of spreading liberal Protestantism around the world and not really appreciating religion. So our notion of religious toleration, there's something deeply flawed in it. And this is very worrying to me. These people, and scholars in that full, and I discuss it a little bit more, as you say, in my article, but they often, it seems to me, also confuse liberal theory with the problems of liberal society. So they want to dismiss these great ideas, I would say, that form the core of liberal democracy, and blame them for everything that's wrong in our society. And in so doing, they often use the language of reactionaries in the past, and I think that they probably don't know this. They're not aware. It goes all the way back to the kind of language that we find in counter-revolutionary thought and extreme absolute monarchists, even, and to a certain extent proto-fascist speak. And I'm not accusing them of being fascist, certainly not, but of using this language, which is confusing and very, very debilitating of values that I in particular hold dear, and I think we all do as well. So this is a very dangerous trend on university campuses, and it's a little bit hard to know how to deal with it, how to counter it, frankly.
To ask this question slightly more broadly, you already mentioned several features of contemporary public discourse which make any kind of countermeasure particularly challenging. Social media was one of them. We have excellent chapters in the book on the culture of victimhood and also a prevailing age of shamelessness in politics. So if we add these two features to the mix, then how do you see the most urgent tasks of reclaiming the language, not only of liberalism and liberal democracy, but also civility in the public discourse? And I direct this to probably to Stephen and then to Professor Shire to close this round up.
Yeah, sorry. I want to elaborate just a bit on what Helena said, and as a response also to Shalini and Matthias. There are two basic ways to criticize a liberal order. One is to criticize it from a liberal point of view, say it's hypocritical, that it has given liberties to common whites. This is in American history, but not to Blacks and Native Americans. So it's a liberal criticism of a liberal order. And then there's the illiberal one, which Alina just mentioned, which is to say everything that's wrong is caused by liberalism. That's the illiberal critique, that is rooting in liberal ideas and in liberal principles. One of the ones, of course, is individualism. And this gets me a sort of response that I've been incubating in my head here since the beginning to Matthias, and I want to talk a little about racism and liberalism, because it is, in a way, there is nothing more illiberal than racism. I mean, liberalism is based on a kind of individualist ideology, individualism in the criminal justice system. You're punished for what you do, not for who you are, not the way you're born. That's the idea of liberal justice. And liberalism basically means treating other people not as if as individuals, has nothing to do with egoism or greed or something. Treating other people as individuals, like, Romeo and Juliet, not as bearers of an identity. Now, this is an ideal. It is very hard to maintain because illiberal emotions in society, especially racism, are self-reproducing. So if we tell American Black teenagers that they should not think of themselves as a racial group, but they should think of themselves as individuals. Well, the fact is they're not treated that way. They're just not. They're treated, the cops, who are the mostly white male cops, who are shooting Black teenagers who have a broken tail light on their car or something, are not treating them like individuals. And it's also true that in our court system, a Black person who commits a crime can be convicted, or is accused of committing a crime, will be convicted with a lot less evidence than a white person, and so on. They're not treated as individuals. And of course, therefore, since the society is not treating them that way, they don't think of themselves that way. They start thinking we must, well, like Black nationalism grows out of that. So it's a problem. I mean, it's a serious issue. It's not definitely, I would say, not the fault of individualism, but it's the fact that individualism doesn't really dominate the mentality of a lot of people in the society, including our police force. So, the opposition between racism and liberalism, I think, couldn't be more profound. I don't think there's any profoundly liberal thinker who doesn't object to racism. Maybe we need a new chapter too. I'm sorry I didn't answer your question, but Andras is going to do that.
You had just shared, it's the burden sharing among the three of us. So thank you, Stephen.
It's a division of labor, yeah.
Well, I'm afraid I will not do the job Stephen was supposed to do. And instead of doing that, I will just complicate his life and Helena's life, because I thought that one of the current characteristics of illiberalism is what already Renata mentioned, shamelessness, and the whole relation to what liberals assume it's possible. They don't claim that it is there, but there is a possibility of getting closer to facts, and you may even grandstandingly say that you're getting closer to truth. So my question is these to the historians of ideas: was anti-liberalism shameless? Was de Bonald or Joseph de Maistre shameless in their criticism? Because, what I remember is the strong language about God, and God is destroying all these ideas, or just take Edmund Burke, who is perhaps not in the same family, but there are resemblances. The way he accuses the French Revolution, the rationalism in French Revolution. But I was not sure that that he is at the level of shamelessness we have today. So maybe that's something new. And I mentioned this because I was in the corner saying that, okay, but we are dealing here with something that was there all the time. So that's one issue I wanted to raise, and I'm really interested to hear whether this disappearance of civility, this 18th century meaning of being liberal, that's not present anymore. Uncivility, total disregard of the other, being a member of a group or being an individual, both ways you are just irrelevant. So is this really in the baggage of illiberalism? Or is this something new that we have to put into the explanation?
Helena first and then Michael, please.
Okay. I think that's a very interesting question. I wouldn't say that Joseph de Maistre, I wouldn't call him shameless. When you're dealing with principles, I mean, certainly very vehement. I think he was a man of conviction and, believed what he was saying. What I think was shameless in the 19th century, when we start talking about liberalism as a cluster of ideas, is when they start using the politics of personal insult, for example. And there is an enormous amount of that in the 19th century. So this is nothing new, that kind of shamelessness. I mean, I have some very juicy quotes in my book on the history of liberalism about, for example, and with all due respect, the popes, for example, what they would accuse liberals and liberalism of. I mean, everything from perversion and they're worse than thieves, they're worse than murderers. This kind of a language has been present for a very long time. And incivility, historians of early America will say that there was plenty of lack of civility going back then. And I think that this has actually existed very, very long time, being just rude and obnoxious and lying and misrepresenting the other person's position and all of this. I think what is very different today, one of the very different things today, is the media. And somebody mentioned here social media and the internet, for example. It's just now amplifying this kind of anger and this kind of shamelessness, in my opinion. And so this is something that we haven't discussed yet, and the book doesn't. So if we want to add another chapter, I might think about these changes, social media and the threat to liberal democracy.
Michael?
Just pick up directly on what Helena said about social media and shamelessness. The fact that so much of the internet is anonymous removes the possibility of shame. That is, you can't be shamed because you're in an anonymous world where you can't be shamed by social relations. I only feel shame in a context where people I know are in the room, where Stephen's in the room, Elena's in the room, and physically in the room. And the digitization of the public sphere has acted to disinhibit the whole political system. And it's not simply that the technology amplifies this stuff, but because it's anonymous. I've said this before, but it's worth saying because I was in electoral politics. In 5 years of shaking hands, I had 5 encounters with my fellow citizens that was personally unpleasant. But every moment in the internet was a sewer. People would say things anonymously that they'd never dare to say in public. So that's just one thing that I think is new. The enormous weight of anonymous, disinhibited stuff in the public sphere. So that would be one point to make. I think the other thing is, having started all this conversation about civility, I think it's pretty important to not to claim that liberals are the only people who know what civility is. I mean, the entire post-war political order that I grew up in was basically assumed a conservative, often Christian conservative, that worked hand in glove with liberals, with social democrats, and with socialists to build the 30 glorious years that the French always talk about between 1945 and 1973. Liberals walk around saying we invented everything that's decent about the 20th century. In fact, it's not the case. Conservatives were decisive to creating some of the civilities of the post-war order, and they very explicitly subscribe to some of the gentlemanly codes of adversarial competition in politics. And they very explicitly, particularly in Italy and particularly in Germany, places with an active fascist past to get over, conservatism had to demonstrate deep attachment to constitutional order. What is very different now, and this is what Stephen was talking about in the United States, is a conservatism that is at the border of constitutional propriety. It's not merely about civility, it's whether they follow the Constitution of the United States. I mean, so this is new. There's something happened to conservatism, and you see it with Zemmour in France, you see it with AFD, and you see it with the guys in the Netherlands. There is a new kind of conservatism which is essentially insurrectionary in many of its features. And this it does seem to me is new. We have some problems in our own house, and the discussion about academic freedom indicates that liberals and liberal institutions are often making a mess of defending core liberal values. I mean, that's one problem. But the other problem is to our right are people who no longer play by the rules, believe in the rules, support the rules, and therefore we're in a new game. And so we go into the battle with, pretense of civility, and they just laugh at us. And that's pulling everybody out of normal political competition into warfare. That's my point. We're being pulled into warfare by people who no longer observe any of the rules that have actually structured political combat in the 20th century.
Thank you, Michael. We did have a question in the chat, which I didn't pose, but you are indirectly responding to it, which is about the extent to which there is a calculated directness and coarseness in some political actors' communication of their ideas and communicating to their voters directly. There is a reason why that has it's calculated to be both rude and super personal. So it's interesting how the discussion went in that direction. Matthias, you also thought that there is a dimension of the debate which we should add on civility, and then I will pose another question from the chat.
I think Shalini, the rector, just raised her finger, so I'll leave the floor to you, please. Go ahead.
Would you like to answer Renata's question directly?
It was more about the question of whether it or not it does make a difference on this question of civility, where it comes from, whether power, when that incivility comes from a certain location of power, does it make a difference? And when it comes from someone who's evidently not in a power position, and some of the things, and I fully agree that some of these things are definitely not new. And some of the images that came out in this whole discussion about civility was about this incident in post-war Germany. Michael, since you mentioned it, about post-war Germany and Beate Klaasfeld, going up on a podium and smacking one of the politicians on the face because he used to be part of the Nazi establishment. So, and of course, at that moment, that was seen as a huge incivility. This is not something that you do. But today, then we look at it as a sort of act of heroicness. Actually, she's much more known in France than she is in Germany. But these kind of ideas of civility and incivility, does it make a difference? where that civility and from whom it comes from. I mean, it's one thing if that incivility is done at a political level, if someone who's in power, it's a different thing. The consequences are so much different. If it's someone who's, I'm not trying to say powerless, but whether or not it does make a difference. But that was sort of a thought that of images that came up in this discussion. So I'll leave it at this, but thanks a lot.
Because, Renata, if I may, I wanted to address a couple of other points which came up, and just very, very quickly. I think one thing we really need to think about very carefully is the use that so many illiberal actors are making of liberal values in order to exclude. So a lot of the anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant propaganda in Europe at the moment is very much in terms of defending universal liberal values. So I think the whole language of many kinds of liberal values, including women's rights, etc., is being used in order to exclude, in order to fuel resentment. So I think we need to look at the kinds of language which has crossed into the illiberal discourse. But that said, I think one of the points that one of the chapters in the handbook makes very well, I think, is the whole question of how gender is deployed strategically by these regimes. And the kind of strategic work, demographic anxieties, the pushback on reproductive rights, the backlash against women's rights is doing in all of these, across the board, in every one of the illiberal regimes today. And I think that is an interesting point of comparison to say, why is a threatened masculinity so much of a part of the way in which the attack on women's rights, especially reproductive rights, is being configured across the board in all of these societies. And the last point, I think, to the question which you immediately asked about, how are certain kinds of constituencies being mobilized? So a striking feature of most of these illiberal set of practices is a mimicry of marginality. These are majorities who are constantly telling you that they are a threatened minority. And so they're unable to speak because they're being cancelled out. They are demographically under threat because they're going to be outnumbered by all kinds of minorities. So there is a majoritarian mimicry of marginality, which I think lends they're asking for all kinds of protection of their rights as if they were a threatened minority. And I think this is as true of India as of the US, as of Hungary. And I think we need to think about what this means in terms of theorizing.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for joining us, and you are officially excused. Professor Shayo.
Thank you. I just would like to mention what was already referred to by Michael, if I remember correctly, that it's extremely important to be self-critical if you wanna discuss illiberalism. And you are not an enthusiast of illiberalism, not a firm supporter of one or another tenet. A colleague of ours wrote a little note to me via Renata, Professor Laszlo Kontler, reminding me that Burke's point is that it is exactly the revolutionaries who are shameless in undermining all standards of decorum and civility. So when I raised the issue that shamelessness is a characteristic of some kind of presentation of illiberal ideas, and it's particularly true in the context of constitutional adjudication, where illiberal regime judges just plain face say incredible things. But I think to assume that incivility or shamelessness is an exclusive feature, and that the liberal side is not perceived using often the same terminology, and sometimes even they may be right. That I think is something we have to take into consideration. So I'm very grateful to this remark, because at the end of the day, without proper critical reflection, this will become a game of labeling and accusations. Now, let me say something that I forgot to say when Renata asked about the making of this volume. So we had many, many difficulties, and we don't have time for all the difficulties, including typos. But one of the most difficult things was to be in a way balanced. We asked a number of politicals, so-called political thinkers, whom we thought are proud representatives of illiberalism. And sometimes there was simply no answer. Sometimes it was clearly a negative attitude. And then I don't think we are entitled to name this leading East European person who Renata confirms that this is private. So I don't want to go beyond emphasizing that this was someone from Eastern Europe. And he was in a way not just incredulous that we really are interested in the presentation of their views, but he was really offended. So in a way, it was extremely difficult to create some balance in that respect, because we really didn't want to make this volume a declaration of faith condemning illiberalism. And I must say that it's not out of question that many of the criticism voiced by illiberals is to a point, not to the point, but to a certain point. So we really have to be a little bit more flexible, to be a little bit more interested, even if we find those positions contrary to the traditional meaning of being tolerant and the traditional meaning of civility. So all I wanted to say is that whatever we say or believe, and by we I mean most of the authors of the volume, about illiberal phenomena and practices, I think methodologically, in terms of scholarship, in terms of social engagement, it would be very important to understand their concerns. So, and to what extent one can do that is a different story, because it is indeed one of the problems today that it is nearly impossible to get into a meaningful discussion. Perhaps there is no possibility of a meaningful discussion, given the nature of the two positions. If you deny God, it's very difficult to engage in a discussion about the nature of God. So it is a difficult task, but in order to understand, we really have to be a little bit self-critical. That's all I wanted to say, although I missed the boat when I had the first opportunity to do that. So we can be shameless. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, thank you so much. We are certainly at the end of our allotted time and patience of our listeners. So let me turn for closing words to László Bruce, the co-director of the Democracy Institute.
Thank you, Renata. It was a real true pleasure to listen to you, to this conversation, and I enjoyed it immensely and learned a lot. To me, the most interesting part of the book is on the cover of the book, which says this is the first edition. I'm really looking forward to the next one. I enjoyed immensely looking at even just the table of content. I read more, don't worry, but I couldn't read all, but I read some of the chapters already. But I definitely, talking about my own profession, I'm a sociologist in between political and economic sociology on the borderlines of these two approaches. I like very much the chapters that deal with this aspect. Especially I read the piece from Gabor Scheiring that deals with this issue, but also several other mentioned this economic issue. And I assume that after the initial debates on this question, several other issues will be raised in all the different sections. So I only can mention very in a minor part, this section that deals with the economy. I would like to have a little, see in the next edition, more dialogue with angrynomics. The ideas that were developed by Mark Blight and others that really talk to your volume. I see lots of opportunities for further dialogue in that direction, and I'm sure there are many more. So I really would like to thank you for having this volume to initiate a real global debate on a major issue that is of high relevance. I'm really very proud that this happened at DI, and I wish you success in the next round. Thank you so much.